Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And as I say at the top of each show, if you're watching us on YouTube, you know you can also listen to episodes on all major podcast platforms. If you're listening to us on one of those platforms, but you want to see what's happening in our studio, you can check us out on YouTube. And please leave a review, leave a rating, and tell your friends and family members and friends' family members and family members' friends all about the Lunch Hour. I want to bring our guest on. His name is Steve Rauschenberger, and in addition to being a noted American politician and businessman, he serves as president of the Technology and Manufacturing Association. Rauschenberger entered politics in 1992, winning an Illinois State Senate seat for the 33rd District. Known for his conservative stances, he was part of a group called the Fab Five, who were instrumental in shaping fiscal policies in Illinois. He served as the chair of the Appropriations Committee and was involved in launching KidCare, a state health insurance program for children in low-income families. After redistricting in 2001, he was reelected to the 22nd Legislative District and became an assistant Republican leader in 2003. His legislative focus included tax reforms, pro-life policies, and balanced budgets. He made runs for higher office as well, including the U.S. Senate in 2004, which gave us all Barack Obama, Illinois governor in 2006. But after leaving politics in 2007, he founded a lobbying firm, Rauschenberger Partners, and took on various roles in nonprofit and political organizations. In 2015, he became the president of the Technology and Manufacturing Association, a nonprofit representing precision manufacturing companies in Illinois. Steve and I also share a common point in our backgrounds, both of us having attended the College of William & Mary, though not at the same time, where Steve received a bachelor's degree in business administration. Welcome, Steve, and hark upon the gale.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So let's start here. Tell us all about the Technology and Manufacturing Association.
Yeah, throughout the state of Illinois, there's a lot of small and medium-sized manufacturers, tool and die shops. In fact, people talk about Detroit building the Sherman tank that won World War II. The parts for that were all made in Illinois, and Indiana, and Ohio. So Illinois has always been a real big supplier to the auto industry and to other precision manufacturing. So the TMA, the Technology Manufacturing Association, represents those 5 to 100 small manufacturers, employees, 5 to 100, that don't necessarily align always with the Illinois manufacturers, which, of course, are John Deere and Caterpillar and Ford and very large corporations. So we provide service, we do training, we train tool and die makers. It's a great little association that kind of furthers the interests of the small and medium-sized manufacturer in Illinois.
I want to get into the work that you're doing nationwide on credit issues, but let's stick with this for a second, because you hit upon something that I talk about quite a bit, which is the difference between small businesses or even medium-sized businesses and large businesses. And I know, we have the federal regulatory state that's coming down the pipeline. We also have stuff happening at the state level. What are you hearing from your members there about what they're most concerned about these days?
Well, they're most concerned about not being heard.
Yeah.
There's an echo chamber out in Washington, D.C., and a little bit in Springfield, Illinois, the state capital in Illinois, where, the large firms have a good voice, a big voice, as well as the unions in Illinois in particular. And so they're concerned that people understand that 70% of employment in the United States is small and medium-sized businesses. You're not going to go to Amazon and fill the workforce. And a lot of the critical manufacturing done in the United States is built on a base of real strong small manufacturers that supply the parts. Because Caterpillar, John Deere, they basically assemble things. The parts and pieces are all manufactured down the chain. So it's important for policymakers to understand how important the small manufacturers are and how critical it is for them to understand the impact of their policies. The idea that's a great idea and livable for Ford may not work so well in a 200-man tool and die shop.
We're going to come back to Senator Durbin and sort of his issues, but there's a problem within the Illinois congressional delegation, right? You've got at least one member, I'm going to call him out, Congressman Caston, who's calling for this massive overhaul of our transportation infrastructure system in the name of climate change. Talk about how increasing energy costs and increasing transportation costs are going to hit these smaller manufacturers.
Yeah, well, people don't understand, but almost all manufacturing is powered by electricity.
Yeah.
Because essentially they buy electricity, they make compressed air, and they use the compressed air to run their tool and dyeing machines. Illinois has benefited in the past because of our nuclear fleet from relatively low electric rates
Sure.
and compared to other states and other countries. But that's all going away as we close coal plants and we decommission nuclear plants and don't build enough supply.
Wow.
The cost of electricity is rising. And so when you're doing production at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and your utility calls you up and says you got to shut down because it's too hot today and we need your power for electricity, we're talking about destabilizing some of the strongest manufacturing in the country over issues on utilities. And so when they talk about moving between 20 and 25% or 30% of the transportation fleet onto the electric grid, there's not enough work being done, in my opinion, in either Washington or in Springfield or elsewhere about making sure the grid can support it and make sure we can produce that power. You know, today you can't build a coal plant to save your life. Natural gas is not liked by the environmentalists, even though it's a very clean fuel. And most states still prohibit the construction of nuclear stations.
This is something I've got friends who've been in that industry. I've always said, if you talk to somebody and they're spouting the gospel about climate change and climate change is an existential threat, and they're not talking about nuclear, then really it's a political issue as opposed to an existential or security issue. At least that's the way I come down. So let's talk about this other, because we'll come back to your work with NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures. But let's talk about the work that you're doing on credit issues and finance and this coalition that you're a part of and representing 47 states except for New York and California and Illinois.
Yeah. When I got out of the legislature, I had done an awful lot of work both in finance and budget as well as environmental issues and regulatory issues. So I kind of put together an idea that there's a lot of good associations in Washington, D.C. that provide a lot of good information to Congress and to the federal regulatory agencies, whether it's the FCC or the Federal Reserve or the Comptroller of the Currency. But they don't do a real good job of repurposing that information for state use.
Sure.
So I made a pitch to several groups that I had met through my work through the National Conference of State Legislatures saying, let me be kind of your translator and help you take your public policy to a different level at the states.
Yeah.
You do the federal stuff. You got a great shop out here. Let me repurpose for you. So I've done a lot of work over the years with CTIA, the Cellular Telephone Industry Association, and I now do a lot of work with the Electronic Payment Coalition, which represents processors and banks that issue and banks that receive credit cards. Anything involving a debit or a credit transaction, I kind of sort of help out with if there's a state issue. We do a little support on the federal side, but they've got a great federal shop.
But I want to talk to you about this federal shop, because in the end, what's good about the work that you do and doing it at the state level is that it brings you one step closer to interacting with the folks who are most hurting can be most hurt by these things. So we've got this situation where about 12 years ago, Senator Dick Durbin made a swipe at debit cards, regulated debit cards. We're going to talk more about that in a minute because I want to sort of set that up as to why he's taking another bite at the apple. But let's talk about this latest bill, I'm looking at my notes, the Durbin-Marshall Credit Card Competition Act. I mean, it obviously, again, like everything else in D.C., they name it something benign, but it's got sweeping impacts. Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, you need to understand that this is an incredibly competitive marketplace.
Right.
I mean, if you have a mailbox, you're getting offers from different issuers all the time, whether it's Cap One or it's Chase or the bank's Chase, and have built a network of 250 million cardholders across the United States. It's a very desirable network.
Right.
And then it's very competitive on the transactional side. There are 10 major networks that compete with MasterCard and Visa, Discover, American Express. And then you've got the explosion of fintech, which is also kind of competing in the space. And then there's over 150 major processors that do the backroom work. So it's an incredibly competitive marketplace. So when Dick Durbin comes along and says there's not enough competition, we need to put the thumb on the scale and help the retailers cut costs, then you should be suspicious. Essentially, what the bill he's proposing to do would allow a merchant to decide who processes the transaction and what rails, what train it runs on. When you have a Visa card, you've got an implicit understanding that Visa is going to process your card, Visa is going to protect your data, Visa is going to stand behind the transaction if they're going to cover you if there's fraud. What the retailers want is a second network on the back of your card so they can select who will process that card. There's a number of low-cost networks out there that used to do PIN debit, older systems. The Chinese actually have have a network that operates.
That's right. You can
in the
call them
United States.
Chi-Coms. It's fine. I don't mind that.
That's what they are to me anyway.
Yeah.
So what Home Depot and Walmart and Walgreens would like to do is when you come in, they get to choose how your transactions process and who takes responsibility for it instead of you as the cardholder deciding. Now, they'll be able to shave a few points off of that, but the exposure to the customer is substantial, and the loss of resource to the network that built this system means that there'll be less fraud protection. There could be less rewards on those cards, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to get to the reward side of it but let's get to the problem that they're trying to address. You've spent enough time in public policy. I've spent enough time in policy. You and I both know that very frequently politicians are proposing solutions that are in search of problems. As clear as I can understand it, right? The swipe fees, right? This is what we're talking about. Like the swipe, the fee that the merchant pays every time you swipe their card.
Right.
Or every time you swipe your card.
Or dip it.
Dip it or whatever. Yes, or tap it now, which is the thing that I like, which is, by the way, I mean.
You never would have had that under the Durbin bills.
Talk about that, actually. That's
because
important.
It's the revenue that these that they earn from the swipe fees that allow them to migrate the technology to safer and safer.
Right.
It led to the chip. Now, it took 8 years to help the retail community adapt the chip card. So now we've got tap cards, which means there's almost no exposure of your number. The industry has been able to tamp down and reduce fraud.
Yeah.
Almost all the fraud today is card not present. Internet transactions where the seller doesn't see the buyer.
Right, because the whole idea of the chip and the tap, it gets away from the, what do they call them?
They can scam the card. They copy it.
Skimmers. The skimmers, yes,
right.
which a whole Sopranos point about that, right? And that's right. You pull it out. You tap it in. I mean, so that's right. So they are under enormous pressure. The credit card companies are under enormous pressure from consumers to make sure that their data is secure, but they're also under pressure internally because the more that they get exposed to fraud, the more they have to recoup those expenses. So it behooves them to do this. Go ahead.
And think about this. The federal government's been hacked probably 5 times in the last 6 months. Most state governments have been hacked. Universities are hacked, but there's never been a breakthrough into the financial services system. They have absolutely the best data people.
Right.
One of the card networks told me, on average, they have over 200 assaults on their system each hour.
Wow.
So I mean, these are incredibly. And if you have a breakthrough into the system, you're into the banks.
Sure.
Okay, you're not just into Visa or Discover. I mean, it's instructive. Target was a major breach. People don't remember how, but what happened was Target had contracted with a heating and ventilating company to manage their thermostats nationwide. So they had to let him into their system so they could look at the temperature in Abilene, Kansas, or wherever. One of the technicians sold his access code to a hacker.
Wow!
They broke into that system and blew up the cards. So there's all these exposures that are important to secure in the financial services system. So to regulate a competitive marketplace and put the thumb on the scale and reward big box retailers with lower costs. Only hurts the system. Doesn't help it.
And there's an old adage in the intelligence world, which is the likelihood of a secret being kept is inversely proportional to the square of the number of people who know it, which means that if one person knows a secret, it's going to get kept. Yep. If 2 person know it, it's a 1 in 4 chance of being kept, and so on and so on and so on. So what we're talking about here is the more potential routes that are managed in this Credit Card Competition Act. I, again, have to look at my notes for the name. The more potentials for exposure that happen down the road, and that's bad for consumers. This is why I would suppose, because again, we talk about the difference between large manufacturers and small manufacturers. There's a difference between large banks and small. Actually, in this case, I don't think there is a difference. But the small folks, the credit unions, the community banks, they're opposed to this, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. They earn a small percentage of the transaction because that swipe fee is divided 3 ways.
Yeah.
It goes to the issuing bank, who takes the credit risk, pays for the cost of sending the card out. It pays the network that processes it, and it pays the merchant bank, the bank that supports the merchant. So if you're a small credit union trying to stay competitive, you need to offer cards to your customers.
Sure.
Now, sometimes they do that contractually through another big bank or through a processor, but at any rate, they earn a small amount of income from that. They use that income to offset losses in their operation, to provide rewards for their customers, and to provide, in many cases, free checking. The first Durbin Amendment back 12 years ago led to a constriction, almost a 40% reduction in banks that were able to offer free checking because they lost a major revenue source.
It gets into, it's so funny because I worked on some other financial areas in the past, in some of my advocacy work, and the issue of high risk, short-term lending. Again, you go after that. Now, the goal there was to make the post office the small lender of note. But the reality is that the end result is that there are fewer products that get offered and more people become unbanked. I mean, I guess in the end, right, what did Senator Durbin learn from the first time around, or what didn't he learn from the first time around that sort of makes him go down this road again?
Well, he learned that he got a tremendous amount of gratitude from the big boxes.
Yeah.
Big box retailers did very, very well. If you were a government affairs guy in Walmart or in Home Depot or some other, and you helped pass that first Durbin Amendment, you got quite of a stunning bonus.
Sure.
So because you cut their costs of doing debit transactions, and they'd like to do something similar with credit. Now, we were able to make the argument there's a difference between a credit transaction and a debit transaction because there's a credit risk for the issuer.
Right. But in the end, I mean, the folks who are pushing this, they don't have a response to the impact before of forcing people to, out of their banks or getting them, out of their free checking. I mean, the other part of this, right, is that the fees elsewhere within these banks go up. But I guess what they want to do now is they want to regulate those banking fees to sort of get at this.
The advocates say that none of this happened, that there's still free checking, that the banks are all still there, that nobody collapsed, none of the networks closed. And there's some truth to that, but there's also been a reduction in the expansion of debit. There's no reason for a bank to encourage debit the way they were in the past. There's less reason for a consumer to use a debit card because there's no debit rewards or debit benefits. There's less free checking. Now, they would claim there's another cost.
But time out for a second. So this is why, because I want to get into the reward side of it. So this is, I didn't even think about this. See, I'm fallible. So, because I remember the bank that we used, I had racked up a fair amount of rewards on my debit card. And then they emailed me and said, hey,
going away.
Those are going away. And as a result, we wound up getting my wife a kayak. a sit-on-top kayak. No joke about this. That's why they went away.
Yes.
Wow.
When the Durbin Amendment cut by over 40% the amount that a bank, or that they could charge on a swipe fee for a debit transaction.
It's interesting because in this relationship, it was 4 years after the passage. Sorry, go ahead.
There's also the end of Red Box.
Yes.
Do you remember the Red Boxes in the convenience stores? Well, MasterCard and Visa and Discover and everybody had created special debit rates for those because on a dollar transaction they couldn't afford to pay full freight. So there were a lot of cases where the networks and the banks made accommodations to make retail work. But as soon as the Durbin Amendment passed, they could no longer offer reductions for some things because they weren't making it.
It is your basic axiom that when you regulate the price of something, and automatically that becomes the
baseline.
Lower price, the baseline price.
Right.
So then talk about this. So this means that for those of us who have switched over, and I will admit that I've done this, my wife and I made a decision. We're going to switch over. We're going to use our credit card as though it were a debit card. Right? We're going to pay it off frequently, monthly, weekly, because we wanted to. We were taking a special trip. We wanted to get our airline miles.
Absolutely.
If the fees go up, if they can't charge or whatever, then those go away. Talk about that.
If you collapse the revenue stream that the banks and the credit card companies are earning, by force majeure using a federal law to tamp down what they can earn, they've got pressure. They've got to decide how they're going to do it. They're not going to want to reduce cybersecurity. They're not going to want to reduce cardholder reimbursement for fraudulent transactions. Other things are not going to be able to reduce. So it's very likely what happened in Australia when they decided to regulate the swipe fees for both credit and debit. Is in Australia there are virtually no reward cards, no miles, no cash back, no hotel points.
Sure.
Because they took that out of the market. Now, what people don't realize is there's a real social value to rewards cards.
Sure.
Like any network, the value of a network is its breadth.
Yeah.
So, in other words, if you've got a telephone but you're the only phone in town, it's
Sure.
not much good to
Right,
you
of
because you
course.
can't call anybody. The value of the credit card network is by bringing higher income people into the market,
Yes.
you make it possible for them to market to the lower income.
Of course.
Because if you carve out those of us who with discretionary income and encourage us to pay by check or pay in another way,
Right.
okay, the network is less robust.
Right.
So people talk about this as a bad idea because we're transferring wealth. It's not true.
But this is interesting because it's the opposite of what the progressive left is doing on healthcare, right?
Yes.
They will want to force wealthy people into these systems or healthier people into these systems because they can both either financially or health-wise offset the risk of having lower income people or less healthy people.
Let's
in them.
level everybody down
Yes.
into Medicaid.
Yeah. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then that's essentially what some of these, I don't want to say well-intentioned, I think maybe Senator Marshall actually thinks there's some merit in this.
Sure.
But I know Dick Durbin knows that this kind of thing does not enhance or support the
Listen,
banks.
I have a pair of maxims that I use. The first one is one that I came up with, which is even the most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. My father simplified it for me. He said, Andrew, there are many roads to utopia. All, however, must traverse the surface of the earth. But that's
Yeah.
exactly it. I mean, in the end, it doesn't matter what the intentions are
Right.
if the outcome is going to be the same, right?
Right.
Talk about this.
Yeah, and that it's just not in the interest of consumers. There's certainly a reason for big boxes to want to lower their costs. They do it all the time. In fact, the lowest merchant discount rates, the lowest swipe fees out there are controlled by Amazon and Costco.
Sure.
Because they have big volume, they're very competitive, they're aggressive, they rebid them every 2 weeks. So, I mean, it's not like they're getting a bad deal now, okay? But what they'd like to do is pull another 0.4 of a point out of that whole
Sure.
system. And it's just a mistake, a bad public policy to intervene. And these are contracts between competent people.
Right.
So, I mean, these are banks that have entered into contracts with merchants to help them process their cards.
And if there's anybody who understands the sort of how these transactions ought to shake out so that it's fair on both sides, it's got to be both of these entities that can do the
exactly.
negotiation. There's nothing worse than interposing the thumb of government in between the two.
And what people do, I mean, think about a couple things. Number one, they can do cash. They can do cash discounts if
Sure.
they want, but the consumer's not interested. There's also a number of studies that show the cost of managing the cash drawer and the change error exceeds 5%.
Interesting.
So some studies show it's almost twice what the cost of the swipe fee is. There used to be checks, and you used to stand in the grocery line behind that lady writing that check.
yes.
Well, and you pay over 7% in some cases for check guarantees, where you swipe that check
Yeah.
and they guarantee it. So there's reasons that the marketplace has migrated. There's a reason McDonald's wants you to use your credit card in the drive-through line.
Yeah.
It's twice as fast. There's ticket lift. In other words, I'm no longer constrained by what I have in my pocket.
Right.
If I want that second Big Mac or I want the latte,
You've been driving
whatever.
with me recently, so
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's real benefits to the merchant from the credit card
and
transaction.
moving even further down away from that to the app-based app-based credit system.
And you ever
So, yeah.
wonder why the big stores got rid of their own credit cards?
Yeah.
They used to have their
Oh,
own.
sure. I remember.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and you know what? They got rid of them because they were more expensive
Right.
to manage than using.
Right.
So-
And because you got to pay all levels of this.
So
Yeah,
you've got
yeah.
you've got external evidence that shows this is a very effective system, cost effective, costs less than cash in many cases, costs less than a store charge. So why are we injecting government and the Federal Reserve and other people into a
Right.
system that works?
Right, I agree. So, and the other thing that I find very interesting in all this is that it's not being done in a standalone bill. This is being attached to the defense appropriations, which ironically it will hurt members of the military. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, they don't have enough votes to pass this on their own. They
Yeah.
didn't ever have enough votes to pass the first Durbin Amendment, which damaged, I believe, the debit card
I
system.
agree.
So they had to stick it inside something else. And Dick Durbin is a very bright and powerful U.S. senator, and he's got a lot of connections, and he's looking for a home to stick his bad piece of public policy in a must-pass bill.
Yeah.
And that's the wrong way. I mean, Congress really should be drawn, quartered, spanked, yelled at. It's time to start passing standalone bills that the public can understand, that the members can understand.
I mentioned to you as we were talking before the show, my colleague Jerry Rogers, who's now doing a business podcast for the Federal Newswire, The Business of America. Jerry, one of his big items that he talks about all the time is return to regular order in Congress and how that would simplify things.
We had a single subject requirement in the Illinois Senate. We could not gang bills up if they did not relate to each other, and it's a way to prevent log rolling and bad public policy.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about this. So why did you decide to run for office back in '92?
Well, I was a retailer, so my background is.
That's why you took over the family business first.
I ran 3 small furniture stores. We had about 30 employees. So I sold
Did
recliners.
You have your own card?
No, we didn't have our own card. We were happy to take MasterCard and Visa. They gave us a lot of ticket lift.
Yeah.
So in the early 90s, the Illinois government did a really, really stupid thing. They changed the whole way sales tax worked. And I couldn't understand why. It didn't gain them any revenue, but it changed the date that the sales tax was due. So I called my state rep up and asked him why, and he had no idea.
Sure.
And I called my state senator up and said, why did they do this? He said, I don't know, call the retail merchants. So I called the Illinois retail merchants. What I found out was they accelerated the due date on everybody's sales tax across the state of Illinois by 15 days so they could count 13 months in 1 year. So I was just astounded that this is the way state government finance was working. So I decided I was going to run against the 20-year state senator who couldn't be beat. I was going to make him talk about this.
Of course.
Well, the son of a gun retired on me.
There you go. Well, that'll do it.
So I ended up in a primary without an incumbent and got lucky, won a very, very close race by 4 votes per precinct, over 200 precincts. So it wasn't by very many. And so I spent some time down.
Shows you every vote counts, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was I absolutely enjoyed my time in the Illinois Senate.
And you turned around and you took that expertise nationally and you headed up the National Conference of State Legislatures. Talk about that organization, the work that they do, and the work that you did with them.
Well, one thing I found when I was in the state Senate is states across the country, legislators are handicapped by a lack of high quality information.
Yeah.
Many of them don't even have professional staffs. Some of them don't have secretaries that answer their phones.
Oh, yeah.
So, but they're asked to make complex decisions about the wireless network, about banking, about lots of transactions, the medical system.
You just pointed out sales tax acceleration at the state level. Why is this happening?
Yeah,
right?
and the guys that voted for it didn't even know about it. So when I was in NCSL, I worked real hard with NCSL to kind of expand legislator education or legislator. So we did a lot of symposiums, a lot of background work, helping people understand the more complex issues. And it's all voluntary, so of course we didn't reach all 8,000 legislators, but we reached a lot of them. It's because I've always wanted to build up the capacity. As dysfunctional as some people think Congress is, and of course I'm not going to opine on that. I do some Kiwanis and some Rotary. I always tell people, if you look around, 45 of the 50 states work just the way the civics textbook says.
Sure.
If you go to Indianapolis and you've got a problem and you tell them the truth, they'll listen.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they'll do what you want.
Sure.
You go to Jefferson City, you get treated well if it's about an issue. You go to Kansas. I mean, most of the state legislatures still work the way the founders kind of sort of thought they would. So that's the place to start to rebuild.
Which is why I'm going to get up on my soapbox and say that's why the repealing the 17th Amendment is so vitally important.
Yes,
but that's the thing. It's a personal.
You found direct election of U.S. senators.
Yes,
it was one of the crippling things. Yeah. Okay, and it's what changed the way Congress works.
Right, I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. So you just underscored a really interesting issue. You ran originally because you had this conversation with your legislator about the sales tax and the legislator not knowing what was going on. There is a plague of this. And as you said, and that's why you got involved in NCSL. But let's talk about that issue and how that may have become magnified over the last 3 decades. But let's also talk about, has politics changed over the last 3 decades?
Well, I think American politics has always been rough and tumble. I mean, you go back, they called Abraham Lincoln an ape.
Yes.
Jefferson and John Adams were brutal to each other. Things they wrote. So, I mean, American politics has always been a contact sport. So but it does seem very different to me today than it was when I was in the Senate in the 1990s. In the 1990s in Illinois, the Republicans had the Senate, the Democrats had the House, and the governor was a downstater. Yeah. So nobody trusted anybody. Everybody kept an eye on understand each other, and we had to compromise every year. It's where we get all blue or all red that I think the complexion changes, and it gets more brutal. So I do think it's changed. I'm not sure how bad. What was the other part of the question?
Just in terms of the knowledge base, in terms of because I think the issues are getting more complex now. I mean, as they should.
Yeah.
They're going to get more complex.
In the 80s, you might remember, you're probably not old enough, but in the 80s, in the early 90s, there was a term limits movement that
I do remember.
It was, in my opinion, aimed at Congress, but the federal court said that you couldn't pass state laws to manage the congressional or the U.S. Senate terms. So the rifle kind of got turned and it hit the state legislatures.
Sure.
So about half the state legislatures now have term limits in one way or another. So if you pick a term limit, what you're going to end up with is 50% of that term limit is going to be the average length of service.
Sure.
So if you have a 10-year term limit, it means your average legislator is going to serve 5 years.
Okay.
He or she spends the first 2 years finding the bathrooms and figuring out how the system works.
Sure.
So just as they begin to understand, they're term limited out.
Yeah.
So, we've got too short of term limits in a lot of states and a lot of legislative turnover, which gives you a citizen legislature. But in these complex public policy times, that just migrates the authority either into the regulatory state, the executive branch, or into the lobby or the permanent staff.
Right.
So I think that's been a problem, and it's contributed to this, to less expertise on the part of state legislatures.
Yeah.
Not all states have gone that direction, but a lot of states have.
Right, and that's certainly an issue we talk about. At the federal level, even without term limits.
Right.
The expertise gets
Gets
devolved,
lost.
gets lost, but also gets devolved to the executive branch here. So, actually, before we get to Algeria, I noted you worked closely with one of my favorite members of Congress, Don Manzullo, who was chairman of the Small Business Committee. I testified before his committee when I was lobbying for the National Federation of Independent Business. Talk about Don Manzullo and what we sort of lost when Manzullo was out of office.
Yeah, and he was run out by our
yes, of course,
by our pilot.
Yes.
Well, Don Manzullo got elected to Congress.
By the way, he's talking about Adam Kinzinger, who was done great credit to his district. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Don Manzullo got elected to Congress about the same time I got elected to the Illinois Senate. His congressional district kind of rubbed up against the western side of my Senate district. So, Danny Hassert was my congressman.
Okay.
So I had the speaker for a while. It was a lot of fun. But Don was great. He really understood small business. He kind of ran the Small Business Committee. He was involved with TMA, the Technology and Manufacturing Association, before I was.
Okay.
And very supportive of understanding that federal policy needed to take into consideration businesses from 5 to 500, not just what GM wanted or what Boeing wanted. Great guy, and he originally talked about a 10-year term limit. He stayed a little longer, and then kind of out of nowhere in a redistricting, someone out in Washington recruited the perfect candidate, Adam Kinzinger. And it was a knockdown, drag-out, and a pretty close race, as I recall.
It's interesting how much of American history is kind of turned on these things. You mentioned before you came on, you served with Barack Obama. And some, talk a little bit about that, too.
Yeah, I served with himself. 4 years when I was in the majority and he was in the minority, and then 2 years when he was in the majority and I was in the minority. So I kind of got to see both sides. I don't know if you've ever had a friend that was kind of the smartest guy in the room all the time. And some of them develop a lack of appreciation for other people because they think everybody else is kind of dumb.
Yeah.
That would be the way I would characterize Barack's career in the Illinois Senate. He'd fly down there. I mean, he'd zoom down and show up on the floor at 1 o'clock on Tuesday, and by Thursday at noon, you'd see his taillights.
Yeah, sure.
Okay? He wasn't big on working with colleagues. He wasn't a very good
He knew
sponsor.
He was destined for greater things. Someone had told him, said, you're going to be, Barack, you're going to be president.
Although Bobby Rush sent a little shot across his bow 2 years before the U.S. Senate race. You may not remember.
No.
Barack ran for Bobby Rush's congressional seat
yeah.
in a three-way race. Bobby got 70, Brock got 20, and a guy named Donnie Trotter got 10%.
There you go.
So,
well, I mean, it's interesting because you had that Senate race that fell apart. Now, was that one of the years you
Yes,
ran?
I
Okay,
was
so you
in.
ran talk about that. This is the year you had Ryan running, and then folks wanted to recruit Ditka, but you, of course, were running. Talk about that craziness of that.
First thing,
That was Alan Keyes wound up being
Yes.
the nominee.
Yes,
Got it.
yes,
Yes,
yes.
I have friends who can tell stories about that.
On the Democratic side, there were 5 candidates, including Barack and a guy named Blair Hull.
Okay.
Blair Hull was a millionaire who was paying busloads of Illinoisans to go to Canada to buy pharmaceutical drugs.
Interesting.
And he was way ahead in the race, leading.
Yeah.
And in my primary, I had a millionaire, Jack Ryan, who was a Goldman Sachs guy, who'd come back to Illinois and wanted to be in the U.S. Senate. And I was in an 8-way primary.
Wow.
So, but on the thing on my wall at home, when the Chicago Tribune made its endorsements for the primaries on full page, top half is Barack Obama for the Democrats. The bottom is Steve Rauschenberger for the Republicans. And this is this is about 8 weeks out. Well, 3 weeks before the primary, Blair Hull had a sealed divorce decree that the Tribune sued and was released.
That's right, yeah.
And in the divorce decree, he had struck his wife.
Yeah.
Blair Hull, first-time candidate, melted down like a
nuclear
popsicle
meltdown.
on a hot day,
Yeah.
and basically kind of fell apart. Brock went from 3rd to 1st.
Wow.
Okay, when he wasn't supposed to win at all, and shot across the finish line. In my primary, Jack Ryan also had a sealed decree related to child custody. That the Tribune sued, but they didn't get it released till 3 weeks after the primary, after Jack had won. So when it was released, Jack Ryan took tons of criticism because his wife had accused him of inviting her to sex clubs and other things. And as a first-time candidate,
Jerry Ryan,
Ryan.
7 of 9 on Star Trek Voyager for those Star Trek fans out there.
He couldn't handle it either.
Yeah.
In the end, resigned from the race. The Illinois Republican Party, just slightly dysfunctionally, went looking out of state for the perfect candidate to stop Barack Obama, and settled on Alan Keyes.
Got it. And the rest is history. Yes, as I said, I have friends who can tell stories about that. So, in addition to us both having attended William and Mary, we may talk a little bit about that in a second. You and I both spent time in Algeria. I visited refugee camps down in Tindouf, the Sahrawi people. But you've done what sounds like some consulting with their legislature about what they will talk about it, because I don't want to misstate what you were doing there.
Well,
it really is fascinating.
The federal government runs a really good program dealing with North African Francophile democracies, in trying to help them kind of build their parliamentary capacity.
Amen.
Well, you can't get congressmen to take 2 weeks and go and do a training with members of parliament because, just the cost of doing a codex, they're crazy. So the State Department contracts with NCSL to provide legislators to go and help train parliamentarians.
Sure.
So I led a delegation of NCSL legislators and some legislative staff on 3 different occasions to do training with the Algerian Parliament.
Nice.
So it was we were all volunteers. They pay the State Department pays our travel costs, but the work you do is all volunteer.
I went through the same thing with in Morocco with the same kind of consulting with their government about small business and entrepreneurship. So it's
so I was it was one point I was very proud of the State Department because this is an ongoing program, very thoughtful.
Right.
And I get mad at the federal government a lot, but you run into long-term programs where very bright people are doing good things.
There was a time, right, where politics was supposed to stop at the water's edge.
Yeah.
So speaking of maxims like that and sort of good government things, what was it like going from you were born and raised in Elgin, Illinois? By the way, Illinois or Illinois?
Illinois.
Illinois.
You can say the S if you're not from there.
There you go. I just want to make sure. What was it like showing up in Williamsburg, Virginia in 75? So I showed up 15 years later about what was it like showing up in Williamsburg, Virginia sorry, go ahead.
I was the 5th of 6 kids.
Yeah.
Okay. And my mother always wanted an out-of-stater. My 2 brothers went to Illinois State University and actually played football and wrestled. My 2 sisters both went to the University of Illinois. So when I was a senior in high school, did an early decision application. And William and Mary, for whatever reason, they were looking for a special allocation of dummies from the Midwest or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
Invited me to apply, or it granted me admission on early decision. So my choice was to go down to U of I and be with the same kids I was in high school
Absolutely.
with, okay, or to throw caution to the wind. And I had no idea. And Williams, I got there the first time. My brother actually drove me out and kind of dumped me off in front of Yates.
Oh, yeah.
Yates dorm
Yates
hall.
just got torn down.
Oh, did it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep. We'll get that in a second. Yes.
But yeah, so I got there in '74. It was fascinating. I had 4 years there. I loved every minute of it. And I think
it occurs to me, time out, you and I were both in Williamsburg at the same time, because my first time visiting Williamsburg was in '77. So go ahead.
So I thought the dumbest thing I did was graduate in 4 years.
Yeah. No, I mean, listen, I get it. It's a unique place. But yes, so not for anybody else. We get William and Mary listeners. As part of the effort to revitalize the campus, Yates was torn down over the summer. In fact, I have friends who had lived in Yates their freshman year. They came down in the spring to say goodbye. Both my wife and I went to William and Mary. Our younger daughter is a sophomore there now.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. Yeah. And then you're sitting right in the middle of the Rockefeller Restoration.
Oh, yes.
I love the King's Arms, Chowning's, Christiana Campbell's.
Oh, yes.
Used to take the ferry across to the Surrey.
The Surrey House.
The Surrey House.
The Surrey House.
Surrey House is a victim of
COVID.
Was it COVID? Yeah.
The peanut soup. I have a very good friend. My year at William and Mary, she is the unofficial ambassador for Surrey County. She grew up over there. So, one of the things I do like to talk about, and we're going to close up with this. I originally thought about doing a podcast focused exclusively on talking to people involved in politics and public policy, but about their outside interests, because none of us is monolithic. We're not only interested in the one thing. So when you're not engaging in your policy work, what are you doing? What are your outside interests?
We have 4 darling grandkids, 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters in Elgin that we get to see almost every single week, and a pair of twins, a boy and a girl, in Baton Rouge.
Okay.
So we do a fair amount of grandparenting. And what we really love to do is travel.
Sure.
We've probably been to 60 countries.
Nice.
There's some places still on my bucket list that I haven't been to, and a lot of places I'd go back to in a minute. I love Buenos Aires.
Okay.
We love Spain. We've been to Barcelona maybe 3 times. And so the travel I do for my clients helps me build up the miles and the status.
Absolutely.
So that we can do a European trip and an Asian trip almost every single year.
My sojourns in D.C. helped me to be able to pay for, if we go out to Monterey with the family, or we were in Colorado over the summer. We're trying to figure out where to go next summer.
Yeah, I've always learned when I travel. I mean, that was the beauty of the Algerian experience is I took more out of it than I gave.
Right.
I'm certain.
No, well, certainly that was my visit to Tindouf, Algeria. Steve, listen, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today. How do folks find out more about the work you're up to? I'm sorry, I should have said this.
If they go online, the Electronic Payment Coalition's got a robust website. There's lots of information there. If they want to know more about me, if they Google Steve Rauschenberger, if you can guess the spelling, I'm in
It'll be up
Wikipedia.
there.
Rauschenberger Partners is my little firm with just 2 of us, but they're there too. So, but all you have to know is that hands off. That we don't need any more federal help for a system that works well for 250 happy customers.
Here,
250 million
yes.
happy customers.
Thank you very much for joining us today. This has been yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm Andrew Langer. As I've said, you can check us out on YouTube if you're listening to us on the podcast platforms. If you're watching us, go check us out on those podcast platforms. Leave a review, leave a rating, tell your friends and family members. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.